Okay, part of this test that we're going to take this unit is going to have a political cartoon on it, and I had mentioned to students before that this may be something that you have done or haven't done, so if you haven't done a political cartoon before, I think this 8, 9, 10-minute thing will be very good for you. If you have done them, I think it'll be a great review. What I have up on the screen is what I see as the important part of interpreting political cartoons, and really it is the process of interpreting, and I want to stress that when you look at a political cartoon, it is more than just describing what the political cartoon is. And I think sometimes when people, like, some people hate political cartoons, some people really enjoy them. What I think is really important from a standpoint of you in class is this, on a political cartoon, you have to understand the issues of the day. That's why in today's society, if somebody looks at a political cartoon, you might look at one and think, okay, all these people are laughing, I don't know why they're laughing, I don't get it. I would argue this is the part that you're struggling with. You don't necessarily understand what the political cartoon's about, and so therefore you can't get any kind of impact of that political cartoon. From a class standpoint, it's really important to understand that the issue of the day is the content. So looking at a political cartoon, coming into it in a testing situation where you know the background to the Cold War stuff that we've been talking about, and you're able to apply that to the political cartoons. The other two things that are important to look at, and we're going to look at political cartoons here in a second to show you, and that is the idea of being able to look at the symbols and or caricatures that are used by the artist. And again, I'll show you some symbols. Sometimes the symbols, they're written directly on them. This represents the United States, this represents the Soviet Union. Other times they will use the caricatures, and by caricature I just mean it is that kind of overblown image of a person. If you look at Barack Obama today, a lot of times, and even George Bush, they have he has really big ears. They take features and that are prominent features, and they enlarge those features and so forth. So you are going to look at the symbols and caricatures within those cartoons. I would say arguably the most important thing from a standpoint of class is, and I really want to stress this, that idea of knowing the viewpoint. When a cartoonist draws a cartoon, they really are trying to get a point across. That idea of, are they for or against blank? So if you are looking at a cartoon, you should be able to use those symbols, use those caricatures, and say, okay, what is this cartoonist trying to say? Are they pro this? Are they anti this? Is this somebody that thinks the Marshall Plan was a good idea? Is this somebody who thinks that NATO was a good idea? And so that's what you're trying to do. And so as you interpret these political cartoons on the test, what that requires you to do is to write a well-developed paragraph in which you are trying to figure out the viewpoint, and you're bringing in unit content in order to be able to do that. So let's look at a couple of them here. Here's a political cartoon, and you first thing you need to do is to look at it and try to figure out, okay, what's going on here? And if you look at some symbolism, one of the things that I would do is to look at it and say, okay, what does this represent? Well, okay, it's Statue of Liberty, the arm of the Statue of Liberty. You're not getting the whole Statue of Liberty, so there is an element of being able to understand the symbolism without being directly told. I would also look at this flame and take a look at that and say, let me get rid of some of this so we're not marking up everything here. You look at this flame, and you have to think about what that flame represents. That represents the idea of liberty and freedom and so forth. So you have to kind of think through that. Then you have this gentleman who, on the surface, does not look like anybody in particular. He's not a president, but he's labeled as hysteria. And so here's where you need to have that unit content to say, okay, hysteria, that's somebody who is hysterical, that's somebody who's, they're kind of panicking. Then it causes you to think about, okay, what what caused the hysteria at the time. Here's this guy yelling fire, he's rushing up a ladder, and he is going to use this bucket of water to put out the flame on the Statue of Liberty. Well, here's where you start bringing in unit detail, and I just put over to the side, some of that hysteria that was going on, that the HUAC hearings, and I should have put the Hollywood 10 underneath that, that putting Hollywood figures before the United States Congress and then blacklisting them if they didn't go along with it. Just that overall idea of we became hysterical about trying to root out communists, and so you've got then the idea of McCarthyism and those loyalty oaths. This is how you bring in the unit detail to do it. The next aspect then is to look at the overall viewpoint of the cartoonist, and in this case I would say in this paragraph, and as you're bringing in unit content, you would talk about the cartoonist being against all of these kinds of things. Here is a cartoonist that would say these things are dangerous to the United States, and he would link it to this idea of the flame and this idea of the bucket of water, and this hysteria is going to cause this flame of liberty and freedom and all those things that we value as Americans to kind of be pushed to the wayside. And so it's this very direct anti-McCarthyism, anti-HUAC, anti-Red Scare, really. If you look at another one, and let's make this just a little bit larger, we don't have to... You know what? Actually, let's not do that. Let's do this one. Here is one that, if we enlarge it, again, you look at, and you have to kind of look at what's here. And so this one is easy in the sense that, let's do this. This one is easy in the sense that this guy represents Western Europe, and it says he represents Western Europe. And so it really does help to be able to have those kinds of labels that are put on there. This, in the background, you have to look at and say, okay, well, here's the United States. This represents the Marshall Plan delay. Now, I would never put this cartoon on a test simply because we didn't talk about the delay. You do know what the Marshall Plan is. So this cartoon would cause you to look at the Marshall Plan and talk in detail about the Marshall Plan. Then you have this bear who represents the Soviet Union. And you might say, well, how did I know that represents the Soviet Union? You have to put it in the context of the time period, and to see that, okay, when I get down here, this idea of the shadow lengthens, that now you start kind of putting everything together. Okay, here's this bear, he's threatening Western Europe, and Western Europe is waiting for the United States, as it said, with this Marshall Plan. And so this cartoonist tends to be, their viewpoint is one of the Marshall Plan being a positive thing. Now, they talk about the delay, but in this case, the Marshall Plan, if the United States can pass the Marshall Plan, that is going to come in and protect Western Europe, and we're going to protect Western Europe from the Soviet Union. And so again, your paragraph would need to include that viewpoint. It would also need to include some discussion of the Marshall Plan. I think also there would be the requirement of talking about some aspects of Western Europe and what was happening in Western Europe and the problems after the war and the destruction that occurred after the war. And if we do one more here, and again, this is one that I would put on the test. I mean, I'm not going to put this one, but this is one that I think could be put on the test. A fairly straightforward one, a fairly simple one. You have Europe as this guy climbing this steep cliff, and he's being pulled up by, I'm not being pulled up, but he is climbing using this rope. So again, as in the previous one, I would spend some time talking about the idea of Europe and some of the problems in Europe at the time. You notice up here that the rope, it says Marshall Plan on it. And again, that would require you to talk about what the Marshall Plan was. And you can see, I don't think it's as important in this one, the idea of Russia in the background. So the Soviet Union part of this comes into play. And in this case, what I would say is the viewpoint is very positive toward the Marshall Plan. that the Marshall Plan is what's allowing Europe to pull himself up this steep cliff and all these problems that they're having. And if the Marshall Plan didn't exist, then Europe's not going to be able to climb that. And I would say then that the problem becomes, if we don't help Europe in that situation, then we're going to have a problem, because Europe is going to fall. The Soviet Union then will kind of step into that particular situation. Hopefully that helps. And what I would suggest is, if you start looking back at this stuff and you have some difficulty still with political cartoons even after this, make sure that you ask. We may have some time on Monday, or coming in before or after school would be helpful. So again, hopefully this helped.